Spring, 1944. The wind swept steadily across the flat plains of Oklahoma, carrying with it the dry scent of dust and the faint metallic rattle of distant train tracks. Beyond the fences of Camp Gruber, rows of barbed wire cast thin shadows across the packed earth. Inside, thousands of German prisoners lived out their strange in-between existence, far from the front lines, surrounded by unfamiliar landscapes, yet still very much part of the war. Among the latest arrivals was Oberleutnant Ernst Keller, a 34-year-old German officer captured in North Africa months earlier. Keller stepped off the transport truck with a deliberate slowness, his eyes scanning everything, not like a defeated man, but like a surveyor studying new terrain. He noted the guard towers first, their spacing, the direction the searchlights were mounted, the overlapping fields of fire. He glanced at the kitchen building and the water tower beyond it. He observed the soldiers who manned the gates, their posture, their accents. While other prisoners kept their heads down, exhausted from the journey, Keller watched. He was tall, lean, and carried himself with a kind of quiet precision. His uniform had long been replaced by standard POW work clothes, but the way he walked made it clear that this was someone who had spent years in structured environments. The American guards clocked him quickly. "Another officer," one muttered as Keller passed through processing. But Keller didn't react to the words. His attention was fixed on a stack of crates being unloaded from a nearby train, plain wooden boxes marked with shipping codes. He didn't know their contents yet, but he filed away the codes in his mind automatically. That first week in camp was uneventful on the surface. Keller was assigned to a barracks, issued his bedding, and put to work in a lumberyard detail outside the wire. He followed orders without resistance, spoke politely but sparingly, and spent his evenings in the barracks reading outdated American newspapers that circulated among prisoners. He rarely joined in group games or conversations. To the other men, he was a quiet oddity, not unfriendly, just always watching. The guards noticed too. Sergeant McAllister, who ran the lumber detail, once said to another guard over coffee, "That one's got the eyes of a hawk. Doesn't miss a thing. Gives me the creeps." But Keller wasn't plotting an escape. He was studying rhythms. Every day, after work, he walked the perimeter slowly, eyes drifting between the sky, the rail line, and the camp's storehouses. He noticed that trains came more frequently now than they had in March, and that the contents of the shipments were changing. Less raw material, more canned food and medical crates. He noticed that the guards had started wearing heavier gear, even though the weather was warming, suggesting increased field exercises somewhere nearby. He even noticed the radio room had its windows painted over recently, likely to conceal nighttime activity. None of these details meant much individually, but Keller had been trained as a staff officer before being sent to North Africa. He understood logistics like a second language. Armies might hide their plans behind secrecy, but their supply chains always whispered the truth. In the barracks at night, while others played cards or argued about when the war would end, Keller lay on his bunk, mentally replaying everything he had seen. Trains, rations, guard rotations. The tempo of the camp was subtly changing, and it wasn't just here. The American newspapers, though, censored, mentioned an uptick in coastal shipping and unusual activity in English ports. Officially, nobody knew where or when the Allies would open their long-awaited second front. But Keller was beginning to suspect that clues were all around him. One evening, while waiting in the chow line, he overheard two guards talking casually. They mentioned a new convoy of medical supplies that had to be rushed to the East Coast by the end of the week. Keller didn't react outwardly, but the phrase stuck in his head. Rushed, East Coast. He glanced at the food being served that night. It was better than usual. Fresh bread, extra potatoes, increased rations. It wasn't a one-time occurrence either. Over the next few days, the food supply steadily increased. To most prisoners, this was a small mercy. To Keller, it was a signal. You didn't build up food and medical stockpiles across the ocean for nothing. You did it to feed and treat thousands of men who were about to be thrown into something big. By the second week, Keller's quiet reputation had settled in. He was the man who noticed things. Some prisoners teased him for his constant observing. "Always staring at crates like they're girls," one said. Keller just smiled faintly. He had no intention of explaining himself. Inside his mind, a slow, deliberate picture was beginning to form. It wasn't yet complete, but he could feel the pieces sliding into place like parts of a puzzle he'd solved before. The Americans were preparing for something massive, and he intended to figure out exactly what and when. As the days passed, Oberleutnant Ernst Keller began to settle into the rhythm of Camp Gruber. But unlike most prisoners, he treated the routine not as confinement, but as data. Where others saw monotony, he saw patterns forming in the background, like faint ink bleeding through paper. Each morning before work detail, he lingered near the perimeter fence just long enough to watch the trains arrive on the far siding. The camp wasn't a major logistics hub, but its proximity to key rail lines meant Keller could observe the flow of materials heading east. He began quietly memorizing shipment codes stenciled on crates, numbers, port abbreviations, military depot markings. At night, lying on his bunk, he reorganized them mentally like lines on a staff report. Certain codes repeated frequently, notably those indicating food, medical kits, and portable fuel drums. The volume was increasing week by week. Even the guards' behavior had changed. A few of the older sergeants were rotated out, replaced by younger men who spoke less and moved with the brisk energy of troops in pre-operation mode. Keller recognized that look. He had seen it in the weeks leading up to the Afrika Korps' offensives, the sense of rehearsed anticipation, the sharpening of routines. You didn't need to overhear classified information to know something was coming. You could read it in people's habits. One day, while working with a lumber detail near the fence, Keller noticed something that made him pause mid-swing. A convoy of trucks passed on the road beyond the wire, loaded not with lumber or coal, but tightly packed crates of field rations. They weren't stopping at the camp. They were heading further east. What caught Keller's attention was the uniformity of the convoy. Same markings, same spacing, a level of coordination uncommon for standard resupply. It wasn't haphazard. It was a buildup. He turned this over in his mind while chopping timber. If these convoys were moving rations and medical supplies toward the East Coast, that meant something massive was being staged overseas, Britain most likely. He had read American newspapers that hinted vaguely about the big push, though they were careful never to mention locations or dates. But the logistics told their own story. Armies didn't move thousands of tons of supplies for nothing, and they didn't do it in spring unless they were preparing for a summer offensive. At night in the barracks, Keller's observations began to draw quiet attention. A few fellow prisoners, curious about his odd routines, asked him what he was always looking at. He didn't answer at first, but one evening, while a group huddled around the dim light of a single bulb, he finally spoke. "You can tell where a blow will fall," he said softly in German, "not by listening to orders, but by watching where they stock the bandages and bread." The others laughed at first. "And what do you see, Herr Oberleutnant? Are they planning to invade Mars?" one man joked. Keller gave a thin smile but didn't elaborate. Instead, he quietly requested access to the camp's library and newspaper rack, privileges often extended to officers who caused no trouble. He began reading American papers obsessively, scanning between the lines for what wasn't said. The New York Times, Chicago Tribune, Stars and Stripes. Each gave him fragments, shipments arriving in British ports, oblique references to unprecedented troop concentrations in England, reports of weather fronts forming over the English Channel. Keller combined this with what he saw every day outside. More trains, larger convoys, more medical crates stamped with U.S. Army Medical Department seals. He even noted postage traffic from the camp's mail office. Prisoners could sometimes glimpse the bins being sorted for outgoing letters, and Keller observed a sudden increase in official military envelopes being routed eastward, likely for final staging orders. It was as if the entire war effort was tilting east toward the Atlantic. And Keller, sitting quietly behind barbed wire, was one of the few paying close enough attention to notice. There was one particular morning that cemented his suspicions. While walking to the work site, Keller saw a train slowing down on the siding. On the last car sat 3 Sherman tanks, freshly painted, their barrels wrapped in canvas. The tanks weren't staying, they were being transported east. He stood there a second too long, staring, and a guard barked at him to keep moving. He nodded and walked on, but inside, something clicked. Tanks didn't move like that unless they were heading for embarkation. By late April, Keller had constructed a rough timeline in his head. He couldn't prove it, but his instincts as a logistics officer screamed that a major Allied invasion was imminent. It would have to be in early summer, when tides and weather aligned, and it would almost certainly happen on the French coast. But where exactly? Keller studied every map he could find. The camp library had an old Rand McNally atlas and a few outdated geography books. He pored over them during recreation time, tracing the French coastline with his finger. Pas-de-Calais was the most obvious choice, closest to England. But Keller thought like an Allied planner. Calais was expected, too obvious. Normandy, on the other hand, was less defended, but still within range. Its beaches were wide and gently sloped. The harbors nearby were serviceable. It was the second best option, and therefore, in his mind, the most likely. He began to whisper his theory to a few trusted fellow officers. They will land in Normandy, June, perhaps the first week. Some laughed, others dismissed it as wishful thinking or paranoia. But Keller wasn't joking. He wasn't guessing. He was deducing. He didn't need a map room in Berlin. He had a train yard in Oklahoma. By mid-May, Ernst Keller's theory had crystallized into something far more than idle speculation. It was, in his mind, a fully formed operational forecast, the kind of analysis he used to present to his superiors during planning briefings in North Africa. But here, behind barbed wire in rural Oklahoma, he had no staff officers to report to, no intelligence branch to hand it off. Just the hum of trains, the shuffle of prisoners, and the rhythm of the camp. Every detail he had gathered fit together like the gears of a clock. Logistical traffic was increasing eastward at a pace that couldn't be explained by routine resupply. Ration crates were being moved in synchronized convoys. Tank shipments rolled through like clockwork. Fuel drums bore markings for ports along the eastern seaboard. The American newspapers spoke carefully, but their omissions said as much as their headlines. The war was pivoting toward one decisive moment. Keller began writing notes on scraps of paper, not explicitly, since the guards inspected everything, but in coded shorthand he had used in the Wehrmacht. Numbers for shipping codes, letters for port cities, weather references disguised as harmless arithmetic. He kept these scraps hidden inside the spine of a worn dictionary he checked out daily from the camp library. During work breaks, Keller often sat alone, eyes half closed as if resting. In reality, he was reconstructing Allied logistical flows in his head. He pictured ports in southern England, Southampton, Portsmouth, Plymouth, and imagined troop embarkation zones swelling with men and vehicles. He traced possible naval routes across the Channel, aligning them with tides and weather conditions he'd read about in newspaper shipping forecasts. His calculations pointed again and again to the first week of June. One evening, sitting on his bunk, Keller spoke softly to a fellow prisoner named Vogel, a former signals officer who had served on the Eastern Front. "They're going to invade France in June," Keller said matter-of-factly. Vogel laughed at first. "And how do you know this, Oberleutnant? Did Eisenhower tell you over dinner?" Keller's expression didn't change. "I know because they've been feeding an army for months," he replied. "Because they are sending medical crates like they're preparing for casualties in the tens of thousands. And because trains don't lie, Vogel. Trains always tell the truth." Vogel's smile faded a little. Keller leaned in. "And they won't land at Calais. It's too obvious. Normandy. Look at the geography. It's their second-best option, which makes it the smartest." Word of Keller's theory began to spread through the camp like smoke. At first, it was passed along as a curiosity. "That officer in Barracks 12 thinks he knows where the invasion will be." Some mocked him. Others, especially those with military backgrounds, listened more carefully. A few even started discreetly watching the trains themselves, verifying his claims. In late May, Keller went further. He approached the camp's German liaison clerk, a prisoner trusted by both sides to pass along administrative information, and asked to speak to an American officer. He wanted to share his observations. It wasn't loyalty to the Allies. Keller simply believed his prediction was too significant to ignore. If he was right, it was an extraordinary demonstration of what careful observation could achieve. The Americans indulged him with a brief meeting. A young lieutenant, polite but skeptical, sat across the table from him in a small administrative room. Keller laid out his theory calmly, without theatrics. He spoke of shipping patterns, ration volumes, newspaper omissions, and Normandy's beaches. The invasion will happen in early June, Keller concluded in perfect English. They will land in Normandy. I can see it from here. The lieutenant stared at him for a moment, then chuckled. You're saying you figured out the biggest secret of the war from Oklahoma? Keller didn't flinch. Yes. The lieutenant shook his head, muttered something about propaganda tricks, and left. The Americans didn't take him seriously. In their minds, he was either a clever agitator or a prisoner trying to sow doubt about Allied plans. Nobody believed a man behind a fence could see across an ocean. Keller returned to the barracks that night more convinced than ever. Not because they'd listened, but because they hadn't. If the Americans truly thought his theory was close to reality, they wouldn't have laughed. They would have silenced him. In the final days of May, the tempo in the camp peaked. Train whistles blew at all hours. Shipments increased to a frantic pace. Even the guards grew edgy, smoking more, talking less. Keller stood at the fence one evening and watched as a convoy of trucks laden with pontoon bridge equipment rolled by. That was it. The final piece. Bridging equipment meant crossing rivers inland, not just beaches. He whispered to himself in German, almost like reciting an equation. Normandy, erste Woche Juni. Normandy, first week of June. No one outside his small circle believed him. The Americans dismissed him. Most fellow prisoners either laughed or ignored it, but Keller didn't need them to believe. He had the quiet satisfaction of certainty and the uneasy sense of watching a storm gather from far away, knowing exactly where it would break. The first days of June arrived heavy with heat and restless wind. The Oklahoma skies had turned pale and hard, the kind of weather that made sound carry farther than usual. In Camp Gruber, trains wailed through the night with such frequency that even the light sleepers stopped bothering to roll over. To most prisoners, it was just noise. To Ernst Keller, it was confirmation. He had been right about the buildup. Now he watched for the moment. In the barracks, word of Keller's theory had spread widely. Some prisoners mocked him good-naturedly, calling him Der General von Oklahoma. Others were uneasy, not because they believed him, but because he sounded so certain. One evening, during chow, a young enlisted man leaned over and whispered, "If you're so sure, why don't you tell the Americans?" Keller didn't even look up from his tray. "I already did," he said calmly. They laughed. Among the officers, the reaction was more divided. Some dismissed his conclusions as arrogant guesswork. Others, particularly those with logistics or naval experience, listened more closely, their faces growing serious. A former Kriegsmarine engineer cornered Keller near the fence one afternoon and asked pointedly, "You really think it will be Normandy?" "Yes," Keller replied simply, "because it's the place they don't expect us to expect, because it's good ground, and because every train that passes this fence is telling me the same thing." The man walked away without another word. Inside his barracks, Keller's small notes and coded observations had grown into something resembling a briefing packet, though he'd never written it formally. Each evening, he mentally rehearsed how he would explain it to a skeptical officer: shipping flows, ration upticks, convoy schedules, eastward rail density, the type of supplies moving. He could almost see the invasion map unfolding in his mind, arrows sweeping from southern England to the beaches of Normandy. But outside his head, the camp moved on as if nothing were happening. Prisoners played soccer in the yard. Guards leaned on fences, smoking, swatting mosquitoes. It was a strange contrast. The largest amphibious invasion in history was days away, and here, in the middle of America, nobody cared that one man behind barbed wire had pieced it together. Keller made one last attempt to be heard. On June 4th, he approached the German liaison clerk again and asked if he could speak to the American intelligence officer who occasionally visited the camp. This time, the request was curtly denied. The clerk shrugged. "They think you're just trying to get attention," he said in German. You're an officer with too much time and too many newspapers. That night, Keller sat outside the barracks under a faint moon, the warm wind carrying the smell of creosote from the railroad ties. He thought about the Channel coast, about the thousands of men waiting in southern England, about how they didn't know that somewhere in Oklahoma a German prisoner was quietly watching the invasion approach like a mathematician watching a clock strike midnight. June 5th came and went without news. Some prisoners teased him. Maybe the invasion was canceled, one said. Keller didn't respond. He knew enough about tides and weather to understand that operations of that scale had narrow windows. If not the 5th, then the 6th. He felt it like a pressure building in the air before a storm. Then, early on the morning of June 6th, it happened. The camp radio, usually reserved for official announcements, crackled to life. A sergeant's voice cut through the static, calling for quiet. Even the guards gathered, heads tilted toward the speaker. A broadcaster's voice, urgent and precise, filled the mess hall. Allied forces have landed on the northern coast of France in what appears to be the long-anticipated invasion. Heavy fighting is reported on beaches in the Normandy region. For a few seconds, there was stunned silence. Even those who had laughed at Keller turned to look at him. He stood very still, hands clasped behind his back, eyes focused not on the radio but on the floor, as if he had already heard it. Then a faint, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. The mess hall erupted. Some prisoners cheered sarcastically, others muttered, a few simply stared in disbelief. The Americans were animated, excited, some pounding each other on the back. The long-awaited D-Day had begun. Keller returned to the fence that evening. The trains still rolled by, but their sound felt different now, like echoes of a secret finally spoken aloud. He thought back to his first days in the camp, watching the crates, the convoys, the patterns nobody else had cared to notice. He hadn't had access to maps, code books, or intercepted transmissions. All he'd had were eyes, logic, and patience, and with those he had anticipated the greatest amphibious operation in modern history. No one congratulated him. No official note was made. The Americans still thought his earlier prediction was just a coincidence. But among the prisoners, something changed. The men who had laughed now nodded respectfully when he passed. A few even asked him questions about how he had known. He explained calmly, like a teacher. I watched their trains. I read their papers. And I remembered what wars need to move forward: food, fuel, and blood. That night, Keller lay on his bunk listening to the distant wind rattle the barracks walls. In France, men were fighting and dying on beaches he had named weeks before. In Oklahoma, a man behind a fence had been right, and nobody had believed him. The news of the Normandy landings swept through Camp Gruber like a gust of hot wind across the plains. Within hours of the broadcast, both guards and prisoners were abuzz with speculation. The Americans, usually restrained in front of their captives, couldn't hide their excitement. Snippets of overheard conversation floated through the camp. They actually pulled it off. It's happening right now. Normandy, can you believe it? For the prisoners, the reaction was more complicated. Some officers stared grimly at the ground, understanding the military significance. Others dismissed it as propaganda, insisting that the real landing must have happened somewhere else, and that the Americans were broadcasting lies to sow confusion. But in the midst of that uncertainty, one man's quiet prediction stood vindicated. Ernst Keller went about his routine as if nothing had changed. He lined up for chow, walked the perimeter during work detail, studied the trains. But now, when he did these things, other prisoners watched him differently. Men who once joked about his Oklahoma invasion theory now approached him hesitantly. They asked how he had been so sure. Some wanted details. Others just wanted reassurance that someone had understood the world outside their fences better than they had. In the barracks one evening, a small group gathered around his bunk. Vogel, the signals officer who had laughed weeks earlier, leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You said it would be Normandy," he muttered, almost in disbelief. "You even said the first week of June. How?" Keller didn't gloat. He spoke in his usual measured tone. "I observed what they moved, when they moved it, and how often," he said, Trains, food shipments, medical supplies, convoys. None of that can be faked. An army preparing for a large operation leaves footprints, logistical ones. They can hide their words, they can censor their papers, but they cannot hide the bread trucks. The men were silent for a moment. One of them let out a low whistle. "You figured out D-Day from here." Keller corrected him quietly. "No, I recognized it. It was there to be seen. Nobody was looking." Word of this conversation spread quickly. Soon, even guards were aware that one of the German officers had called Normandy weeks before the invasion. Most laughed it off as coincidence or luck, but a few of the more thoughtful American officers took note. One intelligence sergeant who occasionally visited the camp requested to see Keller's notes, but of course there weren't any official reports, just coded scraps and mental calculations. Keller had already destroyed the shorthand papers once D-Day began. For the Americans, it was an unsettling thought that a prisoner with no access to radio intelligence, military plans, or reconnaissance could have deduced the most closely guarded secret of the war by simply watching trains and reading newspapers. For Keller, it wasn't about recognition, it was about being right in a world that didn't believe him. He had spent weeks quietly fitting pieces together while others played soccer or bickered over rumors. Now, reality had caught up to his calculations. The irony wasn't lost on him. If he had still been in Germany, and if he had somehow intercepted similar logistical information about the Allies, his analysis might have been taken seriously by German intelligence. But here, as a prisoner of war in the middle of America, his warning had been laughed off by both sides. Still, he kept observing. Even after D-Day, the trains continued to bring new kinds of shipments, heavier equipment, more replacement parts, and larger medical consignments. To Keller, it was obvious that the invasion was not a single event, but the beginning of a sustained campaign. He whispered to Vogel one night, "They are not just landing, they are building a bridge across the continent." Vogel didn't laugh this time. Around mid-June, an American intelligence officer finally arrived at Camp Gruber. He was older than the previous lieutenant, with the quiet, serious manner of someone who had read too many reports. He requested to interview Keller. The conversation was brief, but telling. "So you believe you predicted the invasion?" the officer said evenly. "I didn't believe," Keller replied. "I knew." "From what?" "From your trains," Keller said simply. The officer studied him for a long time before closing his notebook. "Interesting," he muttered, and left. Keller never heard anything more about it. Perhaps his name ended up in some obscure intelligence file. Perhaps it was dismissed as prisoner bravado. It didn't matter. He hadn't done it for them. For the rest of the summer, Keller returned to his routines. The war outside continued to rage, now pushing through Normandy's hedgerows. Inside the camp, he became something of a quiet legend, the German officer who predicted D-Day. New prisoners transferred in from other camps sometimes approached him in hushed tones, as if asking for an oracle's insight into the future. Keller always gave the same answer. "You only need to watch closely. Everything is in plain sight." As summer deepened over Oklahoma, the once shocking news of the Normandy invasion faded into the background hum of war. The trains still passed Camp Gruber daily, but their rhythm had changed. Now, the convoys carried replacement parts, reinforcements, medical evacuations, the telltale signs of a campaign that had shifted from surprise to grind. For the American guards, D-Day became yesterday's triumph. For the prisoners, it was a distant storm still rumbling on the horizon. For Ernst Keller, it remained a quiet, personal victory, not one of loyalty or betrayal, but of observation and intellect. He had watched the patterns before anyone believed him. He had read between the lines of trains, crates, and newspaper columns to foresee one of the most closely guarded operations in modern history. And no one, not the prisoners who mocked him, nor the officers who dismissed him, had truly listened. In the weeks following the invasion, Keller's reputation inside the camp transformed. Men who had once teased him now sought his insight in hushed tones. Some asked if he could predict when the Allies might cross the Seine or when Paris might fall. He always gave the same answer. "I don't predict, I observe." He continued his habit of walking the perimeter each day, studying trains with the same focus as before. But he also began to notice that his freedom of movement was quietly curtailed. Guards were more alert when he lingered too long by the fence. One afternoon, an American sergeant approached him and said bluntly, "You've got a sharp eye, Lieutenant, maybe too sharp." Keller didn't argue. He simply nodded and stepped back. He understood. Even if they hadn't believed him then, the Americans now realized that this quiet German officer had seen things they themselves had overlooked. It made some uneasy. Inside the barracks, his story took on a mythic quality. New arrivals whispered about the officer who foresaw D-Day from a camp in Oklahoma. It was told like a fable, part admiration, part disbelief. Keller didn't participate in these conversations. He sat on his bunk at night, flipping through the camp's worn atlas, following the Allied advance on the maps in his mind. In August, as reports filtered in through newspapers about the liberation of Paris, Keller allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. He thought back to his arrival at the camp in the spring, the long train ride, the dry wind, the first crates he'd seen stacked on the siding. At the time, he had been just another prisoner, stripped of rank and power. But through observation alone, he had reached across an ocean and into the heart of Allied planning, piecing together something that entire intelligence networks had worked to conceal. There was no medal for that, no report bearing his name. The American lieutenant who had laughed at him in May had likely forgotten the conversation entirely. The intelligence officer who'd interviewed him briefly might have filed away a single line in some dusty folder, but among the prisoners, his reputation endured. Not as a hero or a traitor, but as a reminder. Even behind fences, the world could be understood by those who paid attention. On a late summer evening, Keller stood near the fence once more. A train passed in the distance, its whistle long and low. He didn't need to count the crates anymore. He knew the war had turned a corner. The Allies were advancing inexorably through France. The patterns he'd once used to predict were now simply confirming what the world already knew. He took a slow breath and turned back toward the barracks. The others still saw him as the man who predicted D-Day. But to Keller, it was simpler than that. He had simply watched, while everyone else had looked without seeing. In war, there are fighters, planners, and observers. Keller had been all three at different times, but here, in captivity, it was the observer who had reached the farthest.